When Marcus Taylor, a retired FBI agent, was pulled over by a cop who had no reason to stop him, he had no idea that this encounter would set off a chain of events that would shake the nation. The white officer, who assumed Marcus was out of place simply because he was black and driving a nice car, had no clue who he was dealing with. And when Marcus decides to fight for his rights, his choice will shock even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. Marcus Taylor, a 55-year-old black man, exuded quiet authority as he drove his black Cadillac through the sleepy suburban streets. His salt and pepper hair was neatly groomed, and his lean, athletic frame conveyed a life well lived. As a retired FBI agent, he was no stranger to high-stress situations, but on this occasion, he was simply on his way to visit his daughter, a small but meaningful break from his quiet life post-retirement. Dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, with polished leather shoes reflecting his disciplined nature, Marcus maintained an air of elegance, even in casual settings. His gaze was steady as he navigated the roads, his hands gripping the steering wheel with practiced ease. However, his peaceful drive was interrupted when Officer Dave Wallace, a white cop in his mid-30s, noticed Marcus's car at a red light. Wallace, with his stocky build, piercing blue eyes, and cocky demeanor, had a reputation for stopping black drivers, especially in predominantly white neighborhoods, and he saw Marcus as the perfect target. Wallace's uniform was perfectly pressed, and his mirrored sunglasses gave him an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. The officer, with his usual sense of entitlement, immediately decided to pull Marcus over, lighting up his patrol car's siren and signaling him to the curb. Marcus, used to the protocols of law enforcement, calmly complied. He rolled down his window and placed both hands on the steering wheel, the gesture instinctive after years of navigating tense situations. His mind remained focused on the road ahead, his demeanor unshaken despite the sudden intrusion. Wallace swaggered toward the car, his eyes scanning Marcus's every move, as if looking for a reason to escalate the encounter. "License and registration," Wallace barked, his tone clipped and demanding. Marcus, remaining composed, handed over the documents with a steady hand. He then asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" His voice was polite, but there was an underlying firmness that came with years of experience in handling such confrontations. "Just routine," Wallace replied dismissively, his eyes already darting around the interior of the car. His gaze briefly lingered on a small gym bag on the passenger seat. Without hesitation, he demanded, "Mind if I take a look in your vehicle?" Marcus, keeping his cool, raised an eyebrow. "Do you have probable cause?" he asked, his voice calm yet assertive, aware of his rights and the law. Wallace's smirk widened, a flicker of condescension crossing his face. "You look a little out of place around here. That's enough for me," he said, his voice dripping with subtle racial undertones. His assumption that Marcus was a threat because of his race and the neighborhood he was in was blatant, but it was also a product of his own bias. Marcus's heart rate quickened, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He knew what this was. A routine stop turned racially charged, and he wasn't about to let it escalate without challenging the officer's authority. But his face remained a mask of calm professionalism. Despite the growing frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior, Marcus remained composed. He could feel the tension building in the air, but years of experience had taught him not to show weakness. His voice remained steady, almost matter-of-fact, as he addressed the officer. "Officer, I'm a law-abiding citizen. There's no need for this." His words were measured, a subtle but firm reminder of his rights. Yet Wallace didn't seem to register the gravity of the situation. Ignoring Marcus's plea for fairness, Wallace motioned for him to step out of the car. Marcus hesitated for only a moment, weighing his options, but new resistance would only escalate things further. With a sigh, he opened the door and stood tall, towering over the younger officer by several inches. His posture was straight, his shoulders broad, every movement calculated and precise. The authority in his stance was undeniable, but Wallace, oblivious to the quiet power radiating from Marcus, began his task with an air of smug confidence. Marcus's eyes never left Wallace as the officer began rifling through the car, treating it as though it were a crime scene. Without asking for permission, Wallace opened the glove compartment, tossing aside papers, pens, and other innocuous items. He quickly moved to the passenger side and grabbed the gym bag, tugging it open and spilling its contents. Inside, he found nothing that should have raised suspicion, just workout clothes and a few personal items. But his hand froze when he pulled out a small leather ID badge. Wallace's eyes narrowed as he read the title on the badge: Retired Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. For a moment, Marcus could see the slight shift in the officer's demeanor. Wallace's confident swagger faltered as he processed the unexpected revelation. The color drained from his face, and his fingers momentarily trembled, but he quickly masked the shock with a forced composure. He stood still, gripping the badge tightly in his hand as if it were a foreign object, trying to reconcile the man before him with the title in his hand. A retired FBI agent. The thought briefly crossed his mind. Was he in over his head? But the officer quickly regained his bravado. Wallace straightened his uniform and muttered, "This isn't over." His voice strained, but still laced with defiance. He closed the gym bag with an exaggerated motion and stepped back, as though trying to dismiss the awkwardness of the moment. "Just doing my job," he added, as if to convince both Marcus and himself that the encounter had been nothing more than a routine traffic stop gone awry. Marcus's sharp eyes never left Wallace's face. His expression remained stone cold, a silent rebuke to the officer's unwarranted actions. Slowly, Marcus crossed his arms, the tension in his jaw evident. "Your job doesn't include violating my rights," he said, his voice low but cutting. "This will not be ignored." There was no anger in his tone, just a quiet confidence, an unwavering certainty that this moment, this violation of his rights, was something he would see addressed, no matter what. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth and authority. Wallace, sensing the shift in power, took a step back, unwilling to engage further. But Marcus stood his ground, his presence unwavering. He knew this was only the beginning of what would surely become a larger battle for justice. Marcus called his former FBI colleagues, explaining the incident. Within hours, the local precinct received a formal inquiry. Wallace's commanding officer, Captain Morgan, a seasoned black man with a reputation for fairness, was furious. He summoned Wallace to his office. "You had no probable cause, and you didn't run his plates before escalating the situation," Morgan said, his tone stern. "Do you even realize who you were dealing with?" Wallace shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked suspicious. "Suspicious because he's black in a nice car?" Morgan interrupted, his voice rising. "That man spent 30 years protecting this country. He could have had your badge for what you did." Meanwhile, Marcus contacted a civil rights attorney and local media outlets. Within days, the story went viral. Headlines like, "Retired FBI agent pulled over in racial profiling incident," sparked outrage. Social media exploded with discussions on systemic racism and police accountability. The town's mayor, under pressure from the community, called for a public forum on police practices. Marcus attended, dressed sharply in a dark suit, his dignified presence commanding the room. He spoke passionately about the racial profiling Black Americans face daily, sharing his own harrowing experience. "You can't enforce the law by breaking it," Marcus said, his voice steady but powerful. "Change starts with accountability." Under mounting scrutiny, Wallace was suspended and required to attend racial bias training. Captain Morgan worked with community leaders to implement reforms, including mandatory de-escalation training for officers. As for Marcus, he became a prominent voice in the fight against police misconduct, turning his experience into a catalyst for change. His story inspired a movement, proving that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged when the truth is brought to light.